Hey there, mudroomers. It is Carmen here with Mako, and today we're going to review different application techniques using our Stoneware brushing glazes. As many of you may have experienced, applying glazes can be very nuanced and may even need to vary between different products. So today we want to review some basic application techniques to utilize when applying different stoneware products. The products that we will be reviewing today include Tiger's Eye. So we're going to use Tiger's Eye as an example for a standard stoneware glaze. It's an opaque glaze that has variation that's dependent upon the application and will break over texture while still remaining stable. We'll go over Desert Dusk as a standard stoneware crystal glaze. Desert Dusk is an opaque glaze that can produce variation depending on the glaze thickness and crystal application. The base glaze is stable, but heavy crystal loading can create mobility. We'll review Glacier Blue as a transparent stoneware glaze. It is a transparent glaze with a hint of color that builds with application thickness and will break well over texture. And then finally we have Celadon Bloom. Celadon Bloom is a transparent crystal glaze. So the base glaze will perform similar to a transparent stoneware glaze, but with the addition of crystals, some additional attention may be needed during the application. So before we get to glazing, I would like to first discuss the proper tools for the job, and that pretty much means brushes. So when you're looking for a good glaze brush, the primary component that you want to pay attention to is the soft and plump bristles. So all of these are really soft and there's lots of layers of bristles. I see some brushes that don't have multiple layers of bristles, or they're really, really stiff and don't move very well. And that's going to kind of start scraping glaze across the surface rather than building up material on the surface. So you really want to keep in mind something that can plump up and really hold product. Here we use our RB144 number 4 soft fan. So this is what I use as just like a standard glaze brush. We'll also use our number 8 fan. So this is an RB140 number 8 fan. So the bristles are the same. The brush is just a bit larger in size. So this is really helpful when I really want to glaze something thick or if I'm glazing a large piece. So this helps cover more surface area. If you happen to be naturally really light-handed with your brush, this might be helpful to use as a standard brush because it will put more product on the surface without you having to really try hard and scoop a lot of product onto your brush here. So these are my favorite to use for large surface glaze application, and they'll provide the most success when applying your glaze. So once you have the right tools for the job, that's when we're going to want to start glazing. So first we can go over the Tiger's Eye to create sort of like a baseline or a fundamental beginning for this glaze. So I'm just going to go ahead and glaze another one of our test tiles here. I already have glazed this test tile here, so I'm going to be glazing this one in a similar fashion just to showcase you how I got these results here. So first I just want to showcase the different properties of this glaze. So this glaze can create a lot of variation, as I mentioned earlier. It breaks a light brown over texture. So you can see here with the thinner application, you get more of this dark brown color. As you build up application, you get more of those purples, and then you get this nice lighter brown color once you get a full 3 coats. So it's nice to test your glazes with 1, 2, and 3 coats so you can see the spectrum of the glaze's performance as well as help you troubleshoot if you do come into any issues with your glazes. Some examples of standard stoneware glazes include blue surf, stoned denim, alabaster, oyster, cinnabar, copper jade, weathered blue, Norris blue, macadamia, and many more. So again, you can see this glaze kind of pooled in this texture, and that's where I got a bit of mobility, but 3 coats of glaze did not move at all on here. So it's really nice. So to start with your pint of glaze, you'll want to shake it up here. And we'll open our pint up. So before you even start getting your brush saturated with glaze, it's nice to sort of condition your brush with water. So that just makes the bristles a little bit damp so that the glaze moves smoother off of the brush. So I've dipped it in water here, but I'm gonna wanna squeeze all that water out, and then I'm even gonna dab it on a towel over here. So I don't want any water remaining in my brush. Of course, that would be thinning the glaze. I just want a little bit of moisture kind of staying in my bristles here. So once I have my brush conditioned and my glaze is mixed thoroughly, I can go ahead and start coating my brush in the glaze. So typically when I load my brush, I dip the whole end of the brush. I almost use it like a spoon to kind of spin or stir the glaze up a little bit more, just sort of agitating it. And this does mix the glaze some more, but it also ensures that all of my bristles are fully loaded with this glaze. So as you see here, my brush is nice and plump. And I've got glaze just dripping off of my brush here. So I like to take almost like a scoop. So I've got my glaze, it's dripping here, and then I'll start applying it to my surface. So I'm gonna pull it out of the texture here. I don't want too much glaze building up because it'll kind of naturally build up in that area, but then cover my whole entire surface. So at the end here, I started to get glaze scraping, so that's how I know I want more glaze on my brush. So anything like this, you're not trying to scrape the glaze across the surface. You really want to lay the glaze on. Like I've said before, you kind of lay it on like peanut butter. If you think about applying glazes, I like to think of it as a building up of material rather than just painting the surface of an object. So think about getting enough material on your surface. Just covering the surface with the color isn't going to necessarily be completely effective here. So I've got my first coat on here. The first coat does not quite dry instantly, but it dries pretty quickly. You can see here the coat on the back is almost all the way dry. Coat on the front is pretty much all the way dry except for in this texture here. So when you're applying glaze, you'll want to make sure that before you apply your second coat that your first coat is all the way dry. So I can see I touch here, I don't get glaze on my hand. Here is still drying, but I'm gonna go ahead and start putting my second coat on the front, and hopefully by the time I finish that, I can do my second coat on the back. So we can go ahead and apply our second coat here. This one will go on a little bit smoother than the first coat because the bisque has already been saturated, so you don't lose a lot of that moisture by the bisque just soaking it up. So if you had to dip more than once to get the first coat on, you might not have to dip more than once to get the second coat on. So here, my back is all the way dry, so I'm gonna go ahead and do my second coat, and I'm gonna glaze it just like I had glazed the sample tile here. So I'm doing my 1, 2, 3 coats. I would highly recommend testing in this manner with your glazes so you can understand how it will look with your hand on your piece. So here we go. I've got 2 coats. And I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry a little bit, and then we can come back and do our third coat. So you can see the second coat is taking a little bit longer to dry. That's perfect. So this will probably end up taking a couple minutes maybe. See, the front's almost dry already. So I'm just gonna let this sit for a couple minutes and then pop right back in here to get that third coat on. All right, so once we have our second coat dry on our tile here, we can go ahead and apply our third coat. So again, loading up the brush, it's nice and plumped. And then just spread this across the surface. You can kind of see how the texture starts to fill in because you're applying a layer of product. So you're kind of filling in a bit of that detail there. And with glazes like this, it's nice to do a different amount of cross hatching or spreading that glaze out. You can kind of see how your brush strokes show, and the variation in this application thickness is not a super big deal. Sometimes it's nice to even just put it on thick and do that on purpose. So if I were to go like this, then I would kind of intentionally be producing variation in my fired results. So you can definitely mess around and play with this a little bit. It's nice to do it on with some stable glazes doing that way, because sometimes you can get a little bit of extra movement by putting the glaze on so thick. But definitely experiment. There's a lot of different ways you can apply glaze. We just want to showcase just standard practices so that new people, or if anyone's been struggling with their brushing glaze application, can have some tools in their toolbox for applying those. So there we have it. We've got 3 coats. Glaze on the front, and then 1, 2, and 3 coats on the back. And if you haven't yet, definitely check out our designer liners. That's what I use to label all of our test tiles. It's nice and handy, doesn't stick to the shelf, really super easy to use. Definitely a really nice tool to have, especially for signing your work or doing any test tiles so you can keep everything labeled. All right, so that is our standard Stoneware glaze Tiger's Eye. And next we are going to review a standard crystal glaze. So next we're going to be going over Desert Dusk. So Desert Dusk here is a beautiful glaze that produces some wonderful variation where the glaze is heavy and where the crystals create some mobility. So some examples of a standard crystal glaze would include, of course, Desert Dusk, Honeycomb, Sea Salt, Lime Shower, moonscape, winterwood, sandstone, muddy waters, cenote, and there's a few more even, but that's just some examples just to showcase what we would consider to be a standard stoneware glaze, so you can kind of utilize these application techniques across the board with those as well. So first thing you'll want to be sure of is that the crystals are mixed thoroughly. So this pint is one that I've used already. Typically, a new pint of a stoneware crystal glaze will have crystals kind of packed down at the bottom, because we measure the crystals, pour them into the pint, and then run it through the bottling line. So all of the crystals end up on the bottom of your jar. So if you have a fresh jar, just remember to stir it really well. I would recommend using a spoon or a palette knife or stick or some firm object to really make sure you break those up, because they do get kind of crusted down on there. So if you already have a pint, just make sure that you shake it up really well. Some people recommend storing their crystal glazes upside down. That kind of helps all the crystals stay at the top. You could do that, or just making sure you stir your glaze really well. One trick that I found to be super successful when using our stoneware crystal glazes, in particular the ones that have these larger crystal sizes like Desert Dusk, is to scoop my glaze out onto a plate. So this makes the crystals much more accessible, so that you can pick them up and place them as you want without having too much glaze. For a while, I kind of would find myself trying to scoop the crystals up out of our jar here, and basically if I had enough glaze on my brush, all the crystals would just kind of run off of the brush back into my pint. So like I would take this, stir it up, try to get those crystals, and they just kind of fall off with the glaze. So this is a great way to ensure that, first of all, your glaze is mixed all the way. You're getting all these crystals out of the bottom, and that you're getting enough glaze. So here, now that I have my glaze out on a plate, I can spread it out, I can see my crystals and still make sure my brush is loaded. So if let's say my brush is all the way loaded, but I don't have a lot of crystals, I can spread this out onto a plate. My brush already has all the glaze I want, and then scoop up some more crystals without them just running right off of my brush. So here I'm gonna go ahead and apply my glaze. So making sure my brush is all the way loaded. With the crystal glazes, sometimes I notice it's kind of harder to load your brush up as much to keep those crystals on there. So you might need to dip it in the glaze a little bit more, which is totally okay. That just kind of helps disperse the crystals even more evenly. And then also, I kind of focus on having shorter brush strokes. So that kind of helps me make sure I'm spreading my crystals out evenly, and so that I don't have too much glaze building up around the edges of them. So since they are little obstacles on the surface there, it's really easy for glaze to just pool around them. And that can be really, really nice and create some cool effects like you see on this tile here. So this beautiful purple variation is basically caused from the glaze being thick enough and the crystal melting. So this glaze on its own, the base glaze is amber quartz, and amber quartz will produce this purple variation on its own if it's applied really, really heavily, or let's say you had a flux with it or something. These colors are prone to come out, but with the melting of this crystal, it kind of makes it a little bit easier for it to express itself. But that only happens if you have enough glaze. So just having the crystal and the glaze on here won't quite be enough, especially if you're heavy or if you're light-handed. So if you do like these purple colors that showcase themselves with this glaze, make sure you're putting on enough glaze, which hopefully by the time you watch this video, you will know exactly how to do. So now we have our first coat on here. It's not pulled around the crystals too much, but we do still have some wet spots here. So I'm just going to set this down and let this dry for a little bit more, and then I'll showcase applying a second coat. All right, so looks like our first coat is nice and dry here. I'm going to go ahead and apply the second coat. Again, with the short, quick brush strokes to first kind of spread the product on the surface. And then I like to kind of work it out a little bit to make sure that this glaze is spread out nice and even, so we're not getting the pooling around the crystals. And this also helps with making sure you put the crystals where you want them. Some stoneware crystal glazes, this one is one of them, can produce some mobility if the glaze is heavy and if you have a heavy crystal concentration. So you can kind of see here, I tried to pull the crystals up from the bottom in my application, kind of keeping that in mind, thinking that even if they do move down, they'll have this little buffer area for it to melt without running off of my piece. Another thing that you could do is, once it's all the way dry, even just taking your finger and knocking some of these crystals off from the bottom. If you do have a heavy hand and you do end up with a lot of crystals there, it's pretty easy just knocking them off. And then a third technique that you could do to prevent any runoff if you are testing out a new crystal glaze and you're not really sure about your hand and how much it's going to be moving is simply just reseeding your coats. So depending on the size of the thing you're glazing, how heavy-handed you are, and what glaze you're using, what temperature you're firing to, those are all going to affect how much the glaze moves. But while you're figuring it out, you can still reseed your coats anywhere. Usually I recommend anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch per coat, especially if you're anticipating a lot of movement. If it has some movement, I usually only reseed the third coat. So let's say I wanted to reseed this coat. For my third one here, I would go up probably a whole 1/2 an inch, since I have 2 coats all the way down to the bottom. If I go up 1 more coat, anticipating that movement gives me a little bit of a buffer area. If it's something that you think is going to move a lot, or you're really paranoid, you just got new kiln shelves, you want to make sure that it's not going to hit your shelf, go ahead and just reseed all the coats. So do 1 coat to the bottom, do your second coat, maybe 1/4 of an inch from the bottom, and your third coat 1/2 an inch from the bottom, or even maybe 3/4 of an inch from the bottom, just to make sure you have that buffer space to reseed your coats. So this is, a little bit after I apply my second coat. It's still drying. I do notice that the stoneware crystal glazes take a little bit longer to dry, basically because these crystals really help the glaze get applied a little bit thicker. So I can't pull my brush as tight across the surface here when I have these crystals, or I just scrape all of the crystals off. So that kind of ends up with a little bit more glaze building up on the surface. And honestly, I think that's great. I love this variation that happens with the glazes when you do have enough glaze and the crystals are melting. So just kind of familiarize yourself with the products you're using and figure out what works best for you. That's kind of the basic overview of how to apply a standard stoneware crystal glaze. So I'm just going to go ahead and skip the third coat example and just move on to our next glaze, which will be a transparent glaze. So the third coat will go on just like any of those other coats. I might bring it up a little bit. So my third coat, maybe we go down to here. But as you can see here, this one, it does have a little bit of a movement, but it didn't run a lot. You can kind of see where that glaze is bulging there. So you can tell I had melt, but it's not like a runner. All right. All right, so next we are going to review Glacier Blue. And Glacier Blue will be our sample for a transparent stoneware glaze. So here we have Glacier Blue here, just 3 coats on the surface. You can see it breaks really well over texture and even pulls and showcases details really nicely. It's super, super stable, doesn't move at all. I kind of think of this as a clear glaze with a pigment essentially. So it kind of performs like a clear glaze. It's not going to move or anything like that. It's very, very stiff and stable, but the pigments do break over the texture. So here you can see how the color builds up as you add more coats here. So some examples of transparent stoneware glazes would be Northern Woods, Sapphire, Turquoise, Root Beer, Amber Topaz, Coral, Emerald, and Peacock. So any of those, and there's even some more that would perform similar to this one. It's not going to be that different than glazing a standard stoneware glaze. There's just like a couple little things to sort of keep track of. Basically to prevent it from being streaky, I guess, which is really easy to happen when you have that transparent surface like that. So you're going to kind of do everything similar to how you did with the standard stoneware glaze. So we're going to mix it really well. Go ahead and condition our brush. And then we'll load it really well so that brush plumps up really nicely. And I'm just going to showcase one coat on here because 1, 2, 3 coats is pretty much the same. You'll do all 3 coats the same. I just wanted to showcase basically kind of what I mean when I say brushing a glaze out. So I'll first have my brush nice and loaded. I'm going to cover the surface. So I'm just going to cover everywhere first. And this kind of helps make sure the whole surface is saturated. And that helps ensure that the glaze is applied evenly. So, you know, I have it on my surface, it's covered, it's a little janky, it's okay. So I'm just going to keep brushing it. And I'm going to keep brushing it until all this glaze is nice and even. I don't want to create any ridges or unevenness with this. By just continuing to brush it, and I'll even do like a little sweep to create some consistency here. So I did brush all in the same direction, but if you can see, this glaze is really, really even. So I do want to put a nice heavy coat on because I'm still building up those materials, but I want them spread evenly on the surface because I don't want any brush strokes or anything like that. One thing to be mindful of when you're applying a transparent glaze, say over some design work or details that you put directly on the bisque, sometimes the first coat will need to go on quickly so you're not smearing your design. So if that's the case, then go ahead and get that coat on as evenly as you can, and as fast as you can, but without overworking your glaze, because that's how you end up smearing it. So get that first coat on, try to do the best you can, move really, really quickly. Let that dry all of the way, and then when you do your second and third coat, that's when you're going to really meticulously make sure you're brushing that glaze out. And hopefully the first coat wasn't so uneven that it shows through the other two coats, and just kind of hope for the best with that. So yeah, that's how you apply. So all three coats, I would be doing the same thing. This is very stable. I don't need to reseed my coats or anything. Really, really kind of basic stuff, but that's definitely something to sort of keep in mind to ensure that you are applying glaze consistently. And understanding these different nuances about the application can really, really help you in troubleshooting any glaze issues that you have in the future. And next we're going to do our transparent crystal glaze. So here we have Celadon Bloom as our transparent crystal glaze. Some other examples of transparent stoneware crystal glazes would be Shipwreck, Olive Float, Galaxy, Blue Hydrangea, and Enchanted Forest. So all of those should perform pretty similar to this one. Shipwreck has really small crystals, or things that have really small crystals won't quite be as affected by this application because you're not going to have as much space in between your crystals. But this one, it's really, really easy to get super uneven application with it because the glaze builds up around the crystals and is transparent, and you're trying to make sure your coat's applied evenly. So this one's ultimately just going to end up getting brushed out similar to the other transparent glaze, but with the additional component of having the crystals in there. So, and actually this glaze is new. So if you look at the bottom here, I've got some crystals. And so that's what I'm talking about, is that I want to break these up. And I'm going to go ahead and put this out on a plate. So I'm just going to take this spoon and use it for both mixing up my crystals and for putting on my plate. So here we go. I like to go around this edge. Mixed up nice and really well. And so I don't have any more crunching at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and pour this out, or scoop it out, and I like to scoop from the bottom, making sure I'm getting those crystals out of there. All right, and then we'll go ahead, condition our brush, and start glazing. So I can see my crystals and plan them out really well. And I'm gonna start brushing it on. So this is something that I'm gonna be pulling it a little bit tighter than I would be with any other glaze, because I need to be placing these crystals while still trying to make my application even. So I just kind of do like a crosshatch back and forth sort of thing until I don't really have, I have as little streaks as possible and I don't have pools around my crystals. So I'd say that's pretty good here. Just keeping in mind that if you see a buildup of glaze somewhere with these transparent glazes, that will be translated into your fired result. It's not just going to melt or go away. The building up of these transparent glazes adds more pigment to the areas that it's thicker, so that's just going to make it darker in those areas. So I think that goes over some of the different nuances with different applications between Stoneware Glazes. So I know it's a really overwhelming and intimidating process, so hopefully you found this video to be helpful. So thanks so much if you made it through all of it. I really appreciate you taking the time to educate yourself on using our products. So now that you have some basic tips and tricks for success when using our stoneware brushing glazes, thank you so much for tuning in today. We love to hear from you in the comments, so please let us know what you think of this video, or if you have any additional questions or anything, please let us know. So as always, make it Mako.